Okay, I do have the slide thing working. Um, this presentation, I've had like 12 years to prepare for it, which is longer than I've been programming PHP. Um, so it should be really easy, but it's very difficult for me to write. So it started out as pecha, which is like 20 minutes, 20 slides, but I couldn't get the timing down because I wouldn't practice it. So I'm sorry about that. I'm going to manually push the slides, but I'll still try to keep it moving. Is that okay? Hopefully you'll understand why it's so hard for me. So it begins with a phone call. About 11 years ago, almost 12 years ago, I was in graduate school in Illinois, and I was in my office talking to a classmate when the phone rang. And it was my brother, who we never calls me, and he doesn't know my office number. So when he said his first word, like Terry, I knew that something was wrong, and I knew exactly what happened, which was that he came to tell me mom died. So so I'll I'll just tell you that. Just wait. Okay. Yeah, I just have to make sure that that I'm on the right track. My brother and I are pretty close because we're just the two of us, and as children, and these are photos of me and my brother around the time I was very young, and you can see the girl crying in the left side. That's actually me. I didn't like getting a haircut, so. And in the lower right, I'll just show you what sort of person my brother is. That was my favorite boat, which I used in the bathtub. And my dad came to take a photo. And in that photo, I'm older than in all those other photos. And so is my brother. And he's the one who told me to place my boat right there. So he's looking out for me. So at the funeral, my brother asked to give the eulogy, and it was a very long eulogy and very moving, and also it was very sad, and I just didn't want people to remember her that way. Um, so I snuck onto the podium, and I gave my own eulogy, and it's just three stories, and what I'm going to tell you is those three stories. And the first story is about my brother. In order to tell it, I need to tell you a little bit more about my mom. So that's my mom in the photo with her two sisters and mother. When she was a little girl in Korea, she got strep throat. And because Korea was a third world nation back then, they didn't diagnose it correctly. Doctors were incompetent. So strep throat without antibiotics becomes rheumatic fever, which goes into your valves and destroys your heart valves. And you get something called atrial reentrant arrhythmia. And my mom, that meant that her life would be abbreviated. So she spent her life, since she worked in biophysics, researching the science of how and why arrhythmia occurs and how it can kill you. Like when it goes from your atrium to your ventricle, the medical condition is called sudden cardiac death. So how do those states work? And it just happened one time that our local paper, the Pittsburgh Press, had this huge article about her story in the science section called At the Heart of the Matter. And the time the article was published, my brother just entered graduate school. And my parents were totally shocked that my brother, who's the jock in a family of academics, would actually go into academia. So they sent him the newspaper. And he clipped it and he hung it up. And what he did was he kept that article hung up through graduate school as an assistant professor at Berkeley, and now as a professor of economics at Brown. And he tells me that anytime he thinks about how hard his life is, he just kind of looks up, sees the article, and thinks, well, it wasn't that hard. And he likes to say that inside him, he has my dad and our dad and our mom in us. And his dad says, like, relax, go watch some television. And then he goes to watch TV, and his mom goes, what the hell are you doing? Get to work. and that's the sort of person my mom is. Um, in fact, before I started graduate school, I was once lying down on the bed with my dad, and and he had just retired early from Westinghouse. And my mom walks in and starts saying, "What am I gonna do? I have two unemployed bums in the house." Um, and that's just the sort of person my mom was. She was working all the time, and I think in many ways it inspired my brother to become a professor. So I want to show you an example of what sort of professor my brother became. This is an example from his latest research, one of his recent papers. And and what it is it's the paper's known as the Mississippi paper. And this data here is a sample of the data in the paper, and it shows something very interesting. And what is being graphed in red, what is being graphed is black, white infant mortality during the period surrounding the Civil Rights and Medicare Acts in the Deep South. Specifically, infant mortality due to dysentery and pneumonia, two conditions that are almost entirely preventable. And what you see is, before the Civil Rights Act, infant mortality among blacks in the Deep South is so high, it's worse than some third world countries. And afterward, there's a massive convergence within like a 5-year time span. And basically, the hypothesis my brother has is that, or made in the paper, is that since the bulk of these deaths are preventable, it's entirely due to desegregation of the hospitals that occurred. See, Johnson was a really smart guy. They passed the Civil Rights Act, but he knew that nobody would do it. So when he passed the Medicare Act, he actually tied it to the Civil Rights Act. So you couldn't get Medicare dollars, hospitals couldn't get Medicare dollars unless they desegregated. And hospitals in the South are state-run. They were federally created and funded, but they're state-run. And so the states chose to segregate before this. So a comment. So I'll just note in passing that that graph isn't the same, doesn't look anything like that in the Northeast or the Rust Belt. And that just reminds me of a common mistake that's often made in economics and statistics in general, which is you make this you see the data, you make a conclusion. You see this all the time in Freakonomics. The book is littered with this sort of mistake. You make a conclusion that fits your data, and then you fail to test that data to cohorts, meaning subsamples of that should exhibit the same effect no matter how you break down the data, or your hypothesis is flawed. And so what my brother did, and why it's called the Mississippi paper, is this weird quirk about the state of Mississippi during those years. The governor was extremely racist, and he was afraid that the hospitals were secretly giving care to blacks in these white hospitals. So he had the state track every single bed in every single hospital in the entire state of Mississippi, and whether that bed was servicing blacks or whites. So my brother basically gathered bed by bed data, and you can actually see on a hospital by hospital basis when they desegregated. And they all eventually did, because Medicare is a huge, you can't survive without Medicare if you're a hospital. So they all eventually did. It took about 5 years, and you can see the same effect on a county by county basis in the entire state of Mississippi if you just go county by county. And that's why it took about 5 years before the convergence occurred, because it took that many years before all the hospitals eventually caved in and did it. And it's just a really kind of amazing find, because when you think about it, you can see the same. There's a lot of mysteries in sociology, mysteries about why 6 years later, blacks in IQ tests, or 6 or 7 years later, start converging with whites. They start getting smarter for some reason about 6 years later, or why in standardized testing in elementary school, a couple years after that, their test scores start to converge. A lot of people thought it was due to desegregation of the school system. And why you can even see it in entrance exams. They give an IQ test for everyone who enters the military, and you list what state you're born from, and you can see the same data, the same convergence occur 18 years after the Civil Rights Act. And the only thing that fits all of this data perfectly is the Civil Rights Act and the institution of Medicare. So a lot of these, quote, mysteries are actually solved by this one thing. And it's just kind of a lot of people think Civil Rights Act is so long ago, but we're actually talking about people who are in their mid 40s now. So you probably know somebody whose entire life has been changed by this one act, that maybe they're black from the South during that period, or you think and you go like, wow, I know a lot of people who are well-to-do from the South or something like that who are black, but I don't know anyone over the age of a certain age or something like that. So it's this really amazing thing because income is tied to all these things. So from a labor economist perspective, imagine what this small act did and how much what they call human capital was created by just a, a mark of a pen. I mean, everything was there. The beds had been built during the Great Depression. Everything was there. It was just desegregation that did it all. So perhaps you can see sort of what sort of person my brother is and my mom's influence on that. So the second story is about me, or of me, and it begins with the fact that my earliest memories of my mom were as a professor, and she did her high school in 3 years. I mean, sorry, ever since I was a little kid, my mom would work on the teletype at 150 baud, you know, and I was literally this kid driving my little Matchbox cars in on the upright piano and parking them between the keys and stuff like that. So she's always been using a computer, and she's the reason why I got into software and everything. And so all my early memories were of her as you know, just being this professor. And she has this story she likes to tell her students. It's actually about me when I was like about 5 years old. We were once going to get mail, and she looks down and she notices I'm barefoot, and she says, "What's a 5-year-old kid like you doing walking barefoot outside?" And I go, "Well, I look down at her feet and I go, "What's a, you know, professor like you doing going outside barefoot also?" Like, she didn't even notice that she was barefoot. She just liked that for some reason, and it just reminded me that every time, you know, I was so enamored with like academia and stuff like that. Uh, every time I saw a big building, I just you know, the biggest sort of schoolhouse in the world is the University of Pittsburgh Tower of Learning, and it's a really tall building, and so it's I just would tell people my mommy works there. She didn't actually. She worked next door, but so my eyes would get really wide every time I saw a tall building because of that, and it's just this story that my mom shared with her students because I guess, you know, she really liked me and stuff, and we were very connected. And one example of how much that was that my one time I was in college, and my parents bought me a birthday present, and before I got to, you know, unwrap it, my mom like held it back and said, "You have to guess what it is." I'm like, "I can't guess." And then she said, "Well, I'll give you a hint. It's your worst enemy." And my dad started to say, "That's the worst hint you've ever given, you know, blah, blah, blah. That's so horrible." And I go, "Is it an answering machine?" And it was. And the reason why the answering machine my worst enemy is I never call, and I never called home. My dad used to say that mom would actually wake him up and go, "Call Terry, he's dead." and, and my dad's like, "He's not dead. He just never calls home." And so that's why they got me an answering machine, and that's why it's, you know, my worst enemy, and it kind of shows you our connection. And and it and one time I did call home when I was in graduate school, and I talked to my dad, and he's like, and you know, we talked about some stuff, and then at the end, right before I was ready to hang up, he goes, "Terry, why'd you call?" Because I never call, you see. And I said, "Oh, well, you know, to be really honest with you, I had a dream last night that mom died, and it totally freaked me out, and I was feeling really guilty, so I called." And he said, "Well, that's really interesting because mom's heart valve burst on the plane ride to San Diego, and they're actually prepping her for surgery right now." So, so that's just this weird sort of connection thing we always had. So those are the first two stories. What's the last story? Well, the last story is about the person on the other side of this camera, which is, of course, my dad, who sometimes remembers to set up his tripod so you can actually see photos of him. And then later in our life, actually allowed me to take photos of him. So, so about that surgery, what happened was, which my dad never explained, was that he didn't tell me, was that she almost died on that operating table. She was under the knife for 18 hours because when they did the surgery to replace the valve, the heart didn't restart and they kind of freaked out. And they did like a bypass surgery and all of this, hoping that it might work. And eventually she did. And they basically told my dad that very likely she's a vegetable. So my dad would come. He never told us this while this was going on. My dad would come and he would talk about what happened that day. He'd recount what he did. I went golfing or this, and Ken called, and Terry called, and Auntie Gia called, and I thought about you and losing you, and I cried, and blah blah blah. And then the next day, because she might be a vegetable, he said what happened that day, but he also recounted what happened the previous day, which is he went golfing, and Ken called, and Terry called, and Aunt Gia called, and that's it. And then my mom is literally like almost in a coma. She reaches over and taps him and says, "You forgot something." Of course, my dad, being the Korean male that he is, quietly edited out the part where he cried in the recounting. But my mom never let him live it down. So every time they get into an argument, when I was young, I was her lawyer, or that's what my dad called me, because I'd always come up with these clever things to, protect when my mom's mouth runneth over. And she always had a winning reply, which is, "You cried." "Yeah, but you cried for me." So that was her reply. After she died after the funeral, and so that was the three stories. After she died after the funeral, my dad and my brother and I were sitting around, and my dad told me a story, and that's sort of what I want to share to you, and where the title of this presentation comes from, which is because of her fever, they knew she wasn't going to live long, and actually the surgery gave her long enough to have children and also see them grow up. And he never expected her to live that long, and every child was going to be a risk because of the heart condition. So it was never his choice to have children. It was always her choice. And so he never intended to have kids, but mom just wanted them. And then she had that surgery. She almost died, and she lived about a year and a half after that. And in fact, the research she did kind of explains why she would die a year and a half later instead of just after the surgery. But to him, it was like this amazing thing because he thought he lost her and he got her back. So he wanted to tell her how much he appreciated her. So he started calling her his jewel. So he'd say, "How's my jewel doing?" And now that he's dead, because he has these two kids he never intended, he told us that it's like she broke herself in half and gave a half to me and a half to Ken because he sees us and her and us. And so when I call home today, I think it's just an amazing idea that we each give a piece of ourselves, and that's how we're remembered. So when I call home today, my dad goes, "How's my half jewel doing?" And that's my story.